Well, thanks, Chris, for all those introductions, and thanks for the opportunity to present today and to respond to the NFFC's challenge to think about what the future of fruit fly management might be in Australia. So I also want to recognise our First Nation folks today, and I also want to acknowledge the significant team of people sitting in the background in CSIRO, whose research we will be presenting today. So for everyone who's online today, who's engaged with the council in one form or another, I guess everyone's playing some kind of critical role in limiting the impact and spread of fruit fly around Australia. One of the essential pieces in our framework for managing fruit fly is to maintain a strong domestic biosecurity arrangement to manage the risks associated with the interstate trade of fresh produce. And so for the first part of this webinar today, we're going to focus on how we can apply innovative science to give our state and Commonwealth regulators and our horticulture industry members a better set of tools to support risk assessment and then to design risk mitigation for fruit fly and other plant pests and diseases that match the estimated levels of risk. Let me move on to the new one. Is that moving? It's not moving. That's moving. So just to give some context to start with, right? So Australians eat nearly 4 million tonnes of fresh fruit and veggies every year, and most of that's grown here in Australia. So we've got horticultural production happening in almost every region of the country, which means that we've got fresh produce being transported from those regions to every Australian city and town to arrive fresh on our shelves every day. And so all that produce is moving around the country, giving our biosecurity regulators a pretty significant challenge to assess the risks that are posed by that trade, and then to determine the best way to mitigate unacceptable risks that the trade might pose. So there's a whole bunch of questions for regulators that flow from that around how significant is the risk of pest movement on each pathway, what might be the most effective way to mitigate it, how much can we take into account standard commercial practices that might be reducing the risk? Can we use a single measure like a fumigation treatment? Is that available? Is it sufficient? Is it reliable enough? Or might we need multiple measures to deal with that risk? If we're using more than one measure, how do we cumulatively understand the impact or the benefit of those combined measures? How do we efficiently assemble and then communicate the evidence to support our risk management decisions? And is there a smarter way to make use of all the different sources of data that are out there to inform good adaptive management by everyone in the biosecurity system? And if we look at the international landscape, there's an emerging shift in thinking to try to evolve some pest risk management approaches that are more integrated and holistic and embracing of innovation. So our Australian regulators also need to keep pace with those sorts of shifts to respond to the reality that industry's access to traditional agrochemicals is becoming a lot more restricted, that our reliance on single point treatments like fumigation is becoming less viable, particularly for Australian exporters who are really trying to play at that premium end of the market. And that we need to recognise and harness the increasingly sophisticated commercial practices and technologies in our production sites, in our pack houses and through the cool chain, while also acknowledging that we've got a lot of members of our industry who don't necessarily have the top end of the tech or the sophistication that the bigger players have. So we've got to deal with that spectrum of producers. So that's where our phytosanitary risk science work can contribute. So towards getting a more accurate understanding of the risks, to analyse how commercial practices or technologies can reduce them, and to help regulators design entry requirements and market access protocols that are really well matched to the risks that are posed. So I'm going to hand over to Rieks at this moment just to ask this question around how these risk science tools that we're developing can help Australia transition from what's currently a bit of a precautionary kind of trade system towards a more holistic and more refined risk-based one.
Okay. Thanks, Jane. Hi, everyone. Yep, so the focus of today's presentation really is to look at this question of how risk science can help this transition from how we're managing phytosanitary fruit fly risks at the moment to how it might be done in the future. So I'm just illustrating this using somewhat of a caricature of how it's happening globally. So initially there's a risk assessment, and typically regulators of the importing jurisdiction, which are essentially the risk takers, will take the worst case scenario when they're doing a risk assessment. And they'll have an acceptable level of protection that they want that risk to be below. Yeah, Jane? So when in this case, the worst case scenario of risk is much higher than their acceptable level of protection, of course, then they'll impose an entry requirement, which is typically an endpoint treatment, probe at 8.7 or 9, so it requires a 99.99% mortality. So you'll all be familiar with that. But what if you were to take into account commercial practices? So we all know that this a big focus of commercial production is to manage pests and diseases, and we rarely see infested fruit in the shops. So by and large, you would believe that at commercial practices, production the risk is much lower for fruit coming from commercial production. If these can't be recognised, then you still require an entry requirement of an endpoint treatment, which of course doesn't recognise all the good practices that commercial businesses might be doing to reduce risk. Yep, Jane. But what if you were to convince a regulator that the commercial productions were really reducing the risk by quite dramatically? That then gives you the opportunity to negotiate reduced entry requirements. And the question is what that might look like. So that's worst case commercial production. But in reality, different businesses are going to have different levels of risk depending on perhaps where they are, their specific production practices and the supply chain practices that they might undertake. So you'd expect a whole range of risk profiles to occur. What if then we can actually tailor the entry requirements so that it's proportionate to the risk of every particular business, guided by data from that business? So you can see we've talked through a transition from a very compliance-based approach, taking the worst case risk scenario, blanket approach for the whole industry, which is an endpoint treatment, towards more of an assurance-based trading system where it's based on an understanding of individual risk and application of entry requirements based on that. So to achieve this vision, risk science can have a really important role. And some of the questions that are currently really quite difficult to address to be able to achieve this shift is what's the risk under commercial practices, and how do you actually demonstrate that commercial practice actually reduce that risk to that level, to the satisfaction of an importing jurisdiction? What sorts of evidence do you need to provide to give support for those claims? Of course, a broader risk management toolkit is also required beyond just endpoint treatments to manage risk proportionally. And if we really want to go towards assurance-based trade, we're recognising risk-reducing activities of individual businesses. It almost certainly require digital approaches to provide the data that trading partners need to be able to assess risk. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Rieks. So we're just going to dive into a bit more detail now. We're going to have a closer look at a few of the things in our phytosanitary risk science toolkit. And then after that, we'll be looking a bit more sort of towards the horizon to some of the emerging technologies from ag tech and digital tech, and some of the new kinds of analytics that are becoming possible to transform how we do biosecurity, so that you can have a think about what possibilities that might open for our efforts to manage fruit fly. This is our current toolkit for phytosanitary risk assessment and risk management. And I guess we're really hoping over the next few years we'll have a few more things that we can add into this box. And the foundation for pretty much everything in the toolkit is our phytosanitary risk framework, the risk reduction framework. So that's where I'm going to start. So the IPPC, the International Plant Protection Committee, provides some good guidance on what a phytosanitary measure is, right? So a thing that has the purpose of preventing the introduction or spread of a quarantine pest. And it provides some clarity on the sort of criteria that a measure needs to meet. It needs to be clearly defined, it needs to work, it needs to be compulsory to do, and it's got to be able to be have oversight by the regulator. But it provides sort of more limited guidance on what is a suite of available measures, and how to really validate that they work. And especially where there's a systems approach of multiple measures that you want to use. So the current ISPMs that you can see there on the right, I guess they do list a range of possible measure options, and you'll see that's sort of organised around critical control points. It's sort of got that HACCP style of thinking about things, and the limitations of that are that it's not always completely explicit about how these things reduce risk. And in fact, when you look at some of the things on the list, some of the measures proposed on the list, not all of them actually quite fit the criteria that we've just identified that they're supposed to meet. And a key issue is that by focusing on the control point, what you end up doing is grouping measures together at a particular point that actually work in different ways. And so the risk reducing power of each measure isn't clear, and that makes it really hard to validate that its efficacy, that it works properly, and then even harder to then start to quantify what the cumulative benefit of multiple measures is. So to tackle those limitations, our team has been reviewing. Our starting point really was to review the literature to identify measures that were being used globally for systems approaches for fruit and vegetable trade. And that flushed out hundreds of measures, often similar things described in different ways, but hundreds of measures. And when you really look at those closely, what you can see is that there's actually only 4 different ways that each of those measures might work. So we've called those risk reduction objectives, and they are to minimise exposure to pests when the commodity is vulnerable, or minimise the vulnerability of the commodity to being infested, to reduce an infestation rate, or they might reduce the establishment risk if that product arrives in the destination market. Oops, I should go back a minute there. We simplified those critical control points into 3 consignment stages of where they might be applied, and then we sort of bring all that together in this matrix to show where different risk reduction measures that address different objectives could be implemented in the production process. And so what does that framing give us, right? It puts a focus on how the phytosanitary measure works to reduce biosecurity risk. And the other thing that's transformational about this framework is that it provides 2 really, really useful functions. One is that it gives us an organising frame, and it also gives us an analytical frame to give us a more rigorous, both qualitative or quantitative risk modelling to test and validate the effect of different phytosanitary measures, whether they're used individually or used in a combination. So as we continued our research and our collaboration with biosecurity and market access stakeholders around Australia and internationally, it became clear that this way of thinking wasn't just useful for developing systems approaches for market access, it was actually useful for all kinds of trade-related plant biosecurity issues. And so we tested the framework further. We went back out and did a much wider literature review to see what biosecurity risk management measures were used across any kind of pathway, right? So that was planting material or seeds or grains or wood packaging or shipping containers. And we found that those 4 risk reduction objectives still held. All the measures that we found could still be classified as working in one of those 4 ways. And we were able to start at this point really synthesising all that different information into standardized categories of measures. So we got that down to there being really 39 unique measure types. We also could get a bit of a sense of which measures had quite a lot of supporting research and which were relatively under-researched. And here you can really start seeing how the organising function of the framework works. We can now present the measures according to the risk reduction objective that they meet. And that creates a bit of a one-stop shop or a bit of a menu of measures that can be considered when you need to manage a biosecurity risk for a commodity or develop a market access protocol, whether that's for interstate trade, whether that's movement control in an incursion response situation, or whether that's for international exports. So literally, we sort of feel like we've captured this bit of a summary of all the different measure options that are currently used around the world, summarize them onto one page, and then group them all according to how they measure risk. So I'm hoping you can just sort of see the different ways they've been grouped together and recognize a few of the kinds of measures that you might be familiar with in that menu of measures framework. We want to take this another step to develop a resource or like a reference manual for these measures. So we've developed like a working draft for a comprehensive reference manual for each of the measures that we've identified for the menu. And we're hoping that we can sort of create this like a go-to guide for industry and for regulators to describe what each of these measures is, what kind of data you might need to have to demonstrate that it works, and how the implementation of that measure in a business would be verified by an auditor or an inspector or a regulator, and then how the measure is typically used and how it might be used in combination with other measures. So we're really keen to be collaborating with DAF and with state governments and others over the next year or so to really co-develop this resource. It'd be quite awesome if we could reach a point where there's like a strong national consensus on this to really improve our consistency in our understanding of measures and the terminologies that we're using and our expectations around the sort of supporting evidence that we'd need. So I'm moving on to now looking at Presto, which is where we can show the analytical power of the risk framework. So I'm going to run a short animation in a sec about this, about Presto, which takes the framework and the menu and kind of turns them into this scenario modeling tool that can account for background factors like pest abundance and host vulnerability, and then see what different measures or inspection options might do to impact the likelihood of infested fruit being in a consignment for trade. And I'm going to hand over to Rieks to talk through a bit more detail on that. And I'm hoping that this video is going to run, because I'm never really sure that it will.
Enabling trade while
Rieks?
preventing the spread of pests and disease is a complex balancing act. Many factors influence biosecurity risks posed by trade. An innovative model developed by CSIRO allows industry and regulators to systematically assess these factors and find the best measures to manage biosecurity risks. Presto, the pest risk reduction scenario tool, is available online. Based on the CSIRO phytosanitary risk framework, Presto models the risk of pest infestation in fruit for trade. To start, set the background risk factors of pest abundance and host vulnerability. Then adjust for risk-reducing measures, such as pest management, quality grading, or consignment treatments. Finally, set inspection options. Parameters can be set based on scientific evidence or expert judgment. As each factor is adjusted, Presto calculates the likely percentage of infested fruit. Alternate scenarios can be tested until a risk level is achieved that is acceptable in the target market. When scientific data is used, Presto can inform market access negotiations by quantifying the effectiveness of proposed phytosanitary measures. Even when expert judgments are used, Presto is a powerful tool to compare measures and prioritise data needs. Presto is a world first, guiding the selection of the least restrictive biosecurity risk management measures needed for safe trade. Explore Presto and CSIRO's phytosanitary risk tools at research.csiro.au www.science.org.au/PRS.
Oops.
Okay, and if you're wanting to have a look at that video again or share it, it's available on that website as well. I won't say too much more about Presto other than to say this is the schema of the actual model itself. This is the back end. We've developed the model initially in Netica, but we've since now written in R, so a software language R. And one of the reasons for this is that it allows us to develop web-based interfaces that people can play with. And a second reason is that with time, it will allow us to actually link Presto with real data streams. Just go back one there, Jane. So that the structure on the face of it looks quite complex, but as you can see, it's been structured around the risk reduction objectives, ultimately estimating infestation rate, and we're still working on the fourth component, which is looking at establishment risk. Thanks, Jane. So this is what the web interface looks like. It's you can hop in there and have a play. Essentially, it's a bunch of sliders that you can explore different scenarios with, and some outputs to summarise how those different risk assessments and measures limit risk. So this is one application we've developed for horticulture under the previous project with Hort Innovation, but we're currently working with a product design user experience specialist to really focus on developing something that's most accessible and will be most widely used. Thanks, Jane. So I just thought it'd be helpful to show some of the scenarios that you could look at with Presto and some of the insights you can generate from Presto. So here we've got a comparison between 4 different fruit. On the right-hand side, we've got fruit grown under high pest prevalence. So if we take mango as a great host, and the bars, I should say, represent the probability that at least 1 in 10,000 fruit are infested. Under high pest prevalence, with a good host, you'll always get 100% of fruit. The model always predicts that you get over 100, more than 100, at least, you get 100% of fruit infested over a 1 in 10,000 rate. What about if you grow a poor host in a high pest prevalence area? Just simply being a poor host reduces that risk down, and incorporating even just a 90% kill step brings that risk down to 0. Whereas with mangoes, it really didn't affect things much. How about if we look at good and poor hosts in a low pest prevalence area? So if we have a good host like apricots, the infestation risk is even very low without doing anything, just the pure fact that it's growing in a low pest prevalence area. And of course, if we combine it with growing a low host, poor host status, that risk goes down to 0 without the requirement for any additional entry requirements to bring that risk down. So it just illustrates how, in this case, the importance of pest prevalence and quantifying pest prevalence and taking that into account when assessing risk, and that hasn't been possible before. And also just highlights the point that measures don't need to be fully effective, probe at 8.7, to necessarily be useful within a systems approach. Thanks, Jane. So over the last number of years, we've actually applied Presto in partnership with regulators to a range of different issues. And some of the learning so far is that it's really useful both for the risk assessment and the risk management stages of risk analysis. Can be really useful for evaluating commercial measures. So that's something that's of real interest for managing fruit flies, of course. And this is a way of exploring that and looking at how good the commercial measures might have to be included or considered. The model is the first time that you can quantitatively assess how exposure to pest affects risk. It's been very difficult to take that into account in the past. And of course, that's important when we're considering the value of pest management activities, for example. But we have realised that we need to do more empirical work to really make those relationships strong, and that's something that we're working on in the next couple of years. And it's been super useful in terms of assessing different potential measures to address identified risks and looking at which ones might work the best and which ones might be the most practical to use for industry. So in terms of pesto and fruit flies and future priorities, one is to extend it to pest establishment. So that's taking into account things such as trade volume and the use of the produce in the imported jurisdiction. And as I mentioned before, we're putting a big emphasis on improving the application and the user experience for it to get widespread adoption. Thanks, Jane. Okay, so there's a range of different other models and analytics that we've been developing over the last number of years, and we'll focus on developing further. And all of them, I think, contribute to this broader agenda of helping decision makers make more risk-based decisions, and also helping to recognise commercial practices and their role in reducing risk. So there's a number of models down the bottom there that I won't go into, but they relate to quantifying the value of fruit inspection, of packed fruit versus reject fruit, quantifying the value of crop inspections, which is often a criteria for most protocols, optimising where traps are placed for site-based surveillance within registered sites, and also generating insights from inspection data that's just collected during the course of trade. But the one model I just wanted to give a little bit more attention to was this inference from regional surveillance data, because it ties into our discussion later in this presentation around the real potential for using data, better using data by the industry and regulators. So of course, there's a lot of fruit fly traps out there in the country. They're run by all sorts of different people. They're run by industry and government, private sector, consultants and the like. When we bring that data together, it can generate a huge amount of value in terms of insights. So this is just a small piece of work led by Andrew Broadley from CSIRO, which was analysing medfly data collected by our DPIRD colleagues in Western Australia around Manjimup and some other towns in southwest and Western Australia. And the question Andrew was asking is, what role did dispersal from urban areas play in creating pest pressure in surrounding farms? And you can flip that question on its head and look at who would be the beneficiaries of if the urban population got managed, which farmers would be the beneficiaries. And in this case, in the top, it's the risk with urban spread, and in the bottom figure there, it's if urban spread was brought down to zero. And you can see, for example, in that population in the southwest, it's operating independent of that urban population. And really the beneficiaries in terms of from an area-wide management point of view are really just the growers who are very close to Manjimup. But there's lots of other potential applications we can use with this data. So for example, to infer seasonal pest abundance, using what's going on in traps from across the region, and also applying analytics to provide confidence in pest-free areas or low pest prevalence claims, for example. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Rieks. So we just really wanted to touch at this point quickly on two really exciting projects and opportunities that the CSIRO team have got over the next couple of years to really work with our biosecurity stakeholders across Australia to get these tools and get them into practice, and just use that process to co-develop, co-design, refine, and to continue to improve the risk science and the tools to really make sure they do what we need them to do to support our trade-related biosecurity work. So I've just sort of noted all the different collaborators who are participating across these projects over the next few years, and what's not necessarily obvious from that list, obviously DAF, institutionally, we're kind of connecting into Plant Health Committee and their subcommittees, and particularly the SMART Committee. all of our state government and territory governments, and this specific industry organisations, particularly shout out to APAL and Plant Health Australia as a collective, as a whole, and we'll just continue to be in discussions with folk in the horticulture industry as well, whether that's through peak bodies or Australian Fresh Produce Alliance, members and businesses out there in horticulture land. So the Hort Innovation Project, the Safe Trade Project, is an amazing opportunity to be collaborating, particularly with our state government partners, to see how we can support them to further advance. So we already have a risk-based interstate trade and biosecurity system. How can we push that to the next level? How can we really support our state governments to be using these new and improved tools to help them make their decisions and make all their assessments and set their entry conditions and respond to incursions and all those sorts of challenges that they face. There'll be also a whole bunch of field level empirical case studies that will generate lots of primary data that again allow us to feed that into our models and our risk science tools, again, which will continue to refine them. So there's a lot of really exciting stuff that's going to be happening through the Safe Trade project over the next 4 years. And in parallel with that, we have a collaboration that we're running with DAF, which is called the Managed Pathways Project, again, which is looking at how can we work with the department, the people in import operations, the people in export operations, the people in the plant science and risk assessment teams, to look at how the tools can augment the work that they do. So there's lots of exciting stuff happening for the CSIRO team in collaboration with all of these stakeholders over the next few years. We're just really going to move to the looking over the horizon bit now, to see what's emerging to shape the future of biosecurity around fruit fly and other pests and diseases. So I'm going to hand over to Maryam. Hopefully, Maryam, if you're ready to go.
Thanks, Jane. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to provide a brief overview of our non-destructive scanning project for pest detection in fresh fruit. During the previous talk, you heard about the different measures and entry requirement in trade protocol. However, let's dig deeper into an important question, which is, do we really need to fumigate all fruits in every consignment? Additionally, can visual inspection of 600 subsamples provide us with sufficient confidence that our product is free from the pest of concern? And if the answer is no, then we need to explore novel measures that can assure importing country that our products are free from the pest. In fact, imaging technologies offer promising potential for reducing biosecurity risks associated with both exports and imports. At CSIRO, I'm leading 2 projects that utilize different image processing technology combined with AI to make the pest detection automated. In one innovative approach, we have adopted X-ray techniques, which has a very strong penetrating power to go deep inside the fruits and get the deep information for us. Our objective for this particular project is to develop an automated X-ray quarantine scanner and pest infestation detector, specifically designed for bulk scanning at border. This cutting-edge technology has a potential to serve an effective measure because it enables us to truly inspect and reject infested consignment prior to the departure. So far, we have made significant progress, particularly in the development of the 3D X-ray scanner for bulk scanning, which can effectively identify internal damage in fruits caused by Queensland fruit fly. In the video, you can see the scanning process of 5 cherries, including both infested cherries and control. By utilizing our advanced 3D scanner, you will be easily able to identify the cherries that have been infested. Next slide, Jen, please. In the second approach, in the optical scanning project, we have developed advanced imaging technology combined with AI to effectively detect pests in fruit that are otherwise undetectable by human eye. Our system allows us to identify oviposition damage right after oviposition occurs, which is a novel approach. And I'm pleased to inform you guys that last night we managed to file the provisional patent for this novel approach. Our goal is to integrate this adaptable detection system into existing optical grading technology used in the pack houses. By doing so, we will provide the industry with the ability to identify and remove infested fruits with the targeted pests before they are sent to domestic or international markets. When considering the impact of these two technologies, it becomes evident that the sensor platform developed in these two projects have a potential to significantly enhance the automation of quarantine inspection process. Moreover, if this technology undergo evaluation by the government, they may be recognized as a valuable biosecurity measure in trade protocol. Ultimately, this advancement will give a greater confidence in the regulators that biosecurity risks are effectively managed, even if the trade volume continue to expand. And I would like to mention here that I have been given the opportunity to present a detailed overview of our exciting optical scanning project at the oncoming National Fruit Fly Symposium in July. This highly anticipated symposium offers a unique and valuable opportunity for me to share the insight or findings, exchange idea, and shape the path forward for application of our pest detection system in the pack houses. And I believe if the scientists, growers, regulators, and government work together, we can make a significant impact on fruit fly management and ensure the quality and the safety of our fresh produce. Last but not least, I would like to acknowledge that these two projects are running by my wonderful team members across different business units at CSIRO. Over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Maryam. I'm actually think that I'm now passing back to Rieks to keep working through this data analytics question.
Yep. So the final thing we just wanted to cover was in this discussion around where can we go as a sector is around data, and this theme around data and the potential use of data to support fruit fly management and trade. So there's enormous amount of data that's being collected just to get produce from A to B. The example below is actually for codling moth in Tasmania, but it would be very similar for fruit fly. So there's trapping data that's collected by the government. There's trapping data collected by farms. There's crop inspection data collected by farms and pest management information. Post-harvest, there's often multiple inspections of fruit that's undertaken. There's data on treatments. There's temperature data that can be generated by private players such as Escabox that tracks temperature with the produce through the whole supply chain. And of course, at the border and post-border, there can also be inspections. So this is important for getting a consignment from A to B. But if we look at this data collectively, as I intimated earlier, there's huge amounts of value in terms of insights back to industry and government that can be generated. And just some examples here is insights that can help support area-wide management, that can help growers manage in-season risks by understanding what's happening, not just on their property, but more broadly. Decide what markets to go to. So we've had interest, if it's a particular high risk for a particular property in a particular year, they might decide not to send it to a particularly sensitive market, for example. There's also, if you look at this data collectively over the years, we can do analytics to show how effective the entry requirements are for managing risks, and there's the potential for then using that data to negotiate for improved market improvement. So more better, less trade restrictive entry requirements. Thanks, Jane. So under the Safe Trade project, we've got two commitments that relate to this. One is a roadmap for industry and government on how this potential can be realised, and I'll talk a little bit later around a particular route for that. And we're also committed to doing a case study demonstration of the potential and practicality of this, of generating compliance data and generating secondary uses out of that. So very keen if anyone on the call is interested in being a case study. We have got quite a few different options, but come and talk to me, please. Thanks, Jane. A second stream for the use of data and trade is around automating export compliance, and this is some really exciting work done by colleagues in CSIRO Data 61. It's through the Trusted Agri-Food Exports Mission as well, and partnered with Riata Logic and funded through DAF. So the current focus is actually on red meat, and that's been the case study they're looking at, but they will also look at some horticultural examples. And so this is developing a automated methodology for compliance, for meeting all the entry requirements and the compliance against those for market access. So again, there's an enormous amount of compliance data that gets collected against to fulfil obligations against a whole range of regulations and standards and guidelines. Yep, Jane. What this project has been doing is translating that into code. So you can imagine there's a whole range of different legal documents and protocols and work plans, not just for biosecurity, but for food safety and other requirements, legal requirements. They're encoding that into computer code. And once you can do that, once you've done that, then there's a whole range of different applications that can be used for. So on the bottom left is a really cool three-dimensional graphic. Every point is actually an entry requirement for red meat into America. As you can see, there's enormous number of entry requirements that are needed, and this just shows the relationships between each of those. So little wonder it's very challenging for new players to enter the export market. In transcribing a lot of these entry requirements from paper into code, it also became obvious that there was a lot of duplication between different requirements, and some of them were dated. So one of the outputs that they've generated from this work is a checklist. So instead of needing to navigate that three-dimensional complexity for trade, you can then go through a checklist to make sure that you've got all the requirements covered. A next step, of course, is then to look at which of those requirements are actually already potentially covered by other audit requirements and therefore are ticked off anyway, or potentially there's data streams that can automatically provide assurance that those are being done. So as you can see, this is an important step towards automated compliance and paper-free trade. Thanks, Jane. So I think this is my final slide, and particularly excited about this this initiative. This is the Australian Agricultural Data Exchange, which is just entering into the procurement phase now, and expected to be up and running within the next 12 months. As you'll see in the next slide, there's an enormous number of partners, but essentially this has been the missing piece, I think, for this data story. Is there's enormous amounts of data being generated. It's rightly recognised that there's a huge amount of benefit that can be drawn from that data beyond the immediate purpose of its collection, but how to achieve that in a safe, secure, trusted way without huge computing overheads, and is the problem that the data exchange is addressing. So this is a really exciting initiative. Just next slide, Jane. That I think will create lots of opportunities for both starting to generate additional insights and value from the data that's already being collected, and also for progressing down the automated compliance line. So here you can see the enormous number of partners that have already signed up to this initiative. So DAF, a number of state departments are there, a number of different industry groups and private sector and supply chain, ag tech sort of players are there. You probably noticed that horticulture industries are not there yet, but the invitation is open, and we hope that they will become party to it. I'm sure they will be. But just to emphasise that this is a huge opportunity, especially a huge opportunity over the next 12 months to really be there as this thing develops and help shape it. So one thing that we're also hoping to achieve over the next 12 months is to develop a biosecurity use case for this to start demonstrating the value and starting to create a path to really utilise this potential that this is opening up. So once again, if you're interested in a discussion around this, then yeah, please talk to me. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Rieks. Thanks, Maryam. I guess we just wanted to finish off today by just coming back to that theme around what's the future of safe trade? What's the future of fruit fly management for safe trade? I'll just leave you with some thoughts, I guess, around. I hope you can see from what we've been talking about today that we are making some significant advances in our phytosanitary risk science and our data analytics capabilities, and we think that if by collaborating with our regulators and with industry, we can hopefully really transform the way we deal with trade-related biosecurity risks, such as fruit fly, but obviously for all pests and diseases of biosecurity concern. I hope you can see that there's a really fantastic level of collaboration that we're engaging with between CSIRO as a research agency, many levels of government and industry, so that we can really try to move from that highly precautionary kind of compliance-based system towards, a fully evolved sort of risk-based trade system. And I hope we've given you something a bit exciting around what's emerging in terms of these digital platforms and these analytics kind of dashboards that just open up the opportunity over the next 5-10 years for a really data-driven adaptive management process for biosecurity, and the opportunity to move from those sort of static and audit-based type systems to something that's much more automated and really starting to move to systems that can almost run a continuous assurance, a continuous verification of compliance and credentials. So that's what we thought we'd leave it today. So I guess I'm handing back to you, Chris. Really interested to see what people think, and yeah, really interested to see what kind of questions we might get.
Thanks, Jane. That was a fantastic presentation, guys. It's really exciting to see what's on the horizon, and in terms of the work that you've been doing over the last little while and actually bringing this together. There's a lot to unpack there, but we might open it up now for questions. If anyone has any questions, by all means, jump straight in. I might kick things off whilst we're waiting. Maryam, how much, in terms of your new optical scanning technology, would it be much of an impost for a pack house to implement this technology? How much of a process is it to adapt to employing the new algorithm and those sorts of things?
That's a very good question, Chris. So when I started this project, the first thing that I did, I started looking at the literature, and I found there are so many papers using the different imaging techniques and including NIR, hyperspectrum. And I was thinking that why we haven't managed to get this technology and application to be used for the industry. And then, so when we were designing this technology, we tried to make it simple, which can be easily adapted to the current and existing system in the pack houses. So I would say, and I, right from the beginning, I had some interaction and communication with the agtech sectors and just try to understand how the system is working. As far as I know, they are using quite similar cameras, lights that we are doing to generate the data. So I don't think that it would be really complicated and difficult. But saying that, still we need to test our system or our data in commercial setting. But I don't think that is going to be really complicated because they don't need to change the whole grading system that they have.
Mm-hmm.
So, Maryam, can I just add to that too? Am I right in my understanding that hopefully what that would mean in a practical sense in the pack house is that you just add an additional algorithm layer to the optical scanning system that they already have. So hopefully that's a fairly manageable thing to happen commercially. And then the flip side of that, obviously, and this is what we'll be testing, and I probably didn't really explain that very well in the safe trade part of the presentation, but we've actually got the opportunity through the Safe Trade project to really test this out in a commercial context for codling moth in apples.
Yes.
And that will, in addition to doing the empirical work to sort of test, can we do this? Does it rely, can we do this to the point where the grading machine can reliably toss out those apples that we can find evidence of codling moth in? Then there's that sort of question of developing like the technical guidelines that would go out to industry, and then we'd need to be able to take those to work up a set of regulatory guidelines. And the first port of call would be, could that be considered by our state government regulators? And if we can really show that that's working properly in our domestic system, that perhaps opens up opportunities for a negotiation with an international trading partner to say, hey, we're doing this, we're doing it successfully. Our Australian regulators are confident in this. We've got the data to support it. We've got the scientific publications to show that this works. So
I'll throw in another one there. I'll be a little bit greedy. Rieks, how do you envisage sort of the move towards, sort of this your agricultural data exchange? Really fantastic idea, but I suppose there's some potentially some hesitancy around sharing of data. How is it proposed that hesitancy will be overcome within sort of different elements within industry? I suppose it's great when you've got a system where you can aggregate all the data, but if people want to opt in or opt out, how is that going to be managed potentially? Whether or not you've got an idea or concept around that.
Yeah, so that's a key question, and it's so the important thing is that it's a data exchange, not a data federator or data aggregator. So everyone, the data providers or data owners, maintain control of their data, and at its simplest, it's just providing an API to allow others to access that data for analytics or for developing products or for assurance reasons or what have you. And that's still in negotiation with the provider, but the mechanics of how to actually do that is what the data exchange facilitates. So the simplest, probably least controversial sort of application would be if supply chain actors need to get data from, say, the producers in order to fill out phytosanitary certificates for a particular consignment, then that information is then carried through and shared through the data exchange. And they don't need to set up their own sort of IT infrastructure to manage all of that. But where it's using the data to combine data that's collected over the years and many properties to generate insights for industry or regulators, then of course there's potential for nervousness about how risks are managed in terms of giving secrets away or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be a key, and we've actually got data privacy specialists who are now collaborating with us to find simple solutions for dealing with that can be automated and trusted.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, I'll take the opportunity to highlight that the team here, we're going to be at the National Fruit Fly Symposium as well. So certainly an opportunity if you need to think about it and sleep on it. And when you come up with a few questions, by all means, come across to the National Fruit Fly Symposium and you can ask the team in person, which would be a fantastic opportunity. So if there's no more questions, we might we might finish up there if that's all right with you guys.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, a recording of this will be available anyway on the Prevent Fruit Fly website. I'd like to thank you all for your attendance today, and certainly thank you to our speakers today. So to Jane, Maryam, and to Rieks. Really appreciate your presentation today, and it's fantastic to see the amount of work that you guys have been putting into this. It's quite inspiring to see. But on that note, we might end the webinar now. So thank you very much for your attendance, and we'll catch you again in the symposium. Thanks, guys.
Very much.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Chris.